The Shedeur Sanders draft story was supposed to be settled the moment his name came off the board. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It exploded. What should have been a routine evaluation process quietly turned into one of the most controversial quarterback debates in recent draft memory. And now the New York Giants are standing at the center of it, whether they like it or not. Because here's the part nobody can ignore anymore. One quarterback's interview footage gets released. Awkward pauses, stiff answers, uncomfortable energy, all out in the open for fans and analysts to judge. But the other quarterback, silence. No footage, no context, no clarity, just whispers, leaked opinions, and narratives that seem to grow louder the longer the tape stays locked away. And that quarterback is Shedeur Sanders. What started as light speculation has turned into a full-blown credibility problem. Fans aren't asking for hype. They aren't asking for spin. They're asking a simple question that keeps getting dodged. Why can't we see it for ourselves? If Shedeur Sanders struggled in that interview room, show it. If he didn't, explain the narrative. Because right now, the lack of transparency is doing more damage than any rumored bad answer ever could. This debate stopped being about football a long time ago. It became about perception, about confidence versus arrogance, about who gets labeled competitive and who gets labeled difficult, about how quickly assumptions replace evidence when a player doesn't fit the traditional mold. And once that process starts, it's nearly impossible to slow down. The strangest part, none of it lines up with what actually happens on the field. The numbers tell one story. The tape tells another. Leadership, efficiency, composure under pressure, all boxes checked. Yet somehow the conversation keeps drifting back to one unseen interview, one leaked description, one moment nobody outside the building can verify. And that's where this gets uncomfortable. Because when evaluation becomes selective, trust starts to disappear. When one player's flaws are publicly dissected and another's are hidden behind closed doors, people stop believing the process is fair. And in the NFL, perception matters almost as much as performance. So the real question isn't whether Shedeur Sanders can play. The question is whether he was ever allowed to be judged on the same terms. And once you start pulling on that thread, the entire draft narrative begins to unravel. Here, where the controversy truly took on a life of its own. The moment the Giants allowed Jackson Dart's interview footage to be released, they unknowingly shifted the spotlight straight onto Shedeur Sanders. Because in today's NFL, silence isn't neutral. Silence is suspicious. The Dart footage wasn't flattering. Awkward pauses, hesitation, answers that didn't inspire confidence. And yet the Giants were comfortable letting the public see it. That single decision opened the floodgates. Fans immediately asked the obvious question. If Dart's interview was bad enough to show, why is Sanders' interview still hidden? That question spread faster than any stat breakdown ever could. Reports began circulating that Sanders' interview was concerning, that his answers didn't sit right, that his demeanor rubbed evaluators the wrong way. But here's the problem, none of those claims came with evidence. No video, no transcript, just anonymous descriptions shaping a narrative in real time. And once those narratives hit social media, they became reality for people who never watched a single snap of Sanders' film. This is how reputations quietly change in draft season. What made it worse was the timing. Sanders wasn't struggling on tape. He wasn't coming off a disappointing season. He was efficient, productive, and calm under pressure. So when criticism didn't match performance, people naturally looked for another explanation. Interviews became the convenient answer. But interviews are supposed to clarify evaluations, not override them. Inside league circles, opinions started splitting hard. Some scouts reportedly believed Sanders was being unfairly boxed in by perception. Others felt the interview process mattered more than production. That divide leaked out into the media, and suddenly the conversation wasn't about throws, reads, or decision-making. It was about personality, tone, and whether Sanders fit, what teams wanted. That's a dangerous slope, because fit is often subjective, and subjective evaluations are where bias, intentional or not, tends to creep in. Confidence becomes arrogance, calm becomes disinterest, direct answers become red flags, and once that lens is applied, everything gets interpreted through it. The longer the Giants kept the interview sealed, the louder the backlash grew. Fans weren't defending Sanders blindly. They were asking for transparency. They wanted to judge the moment themselves, the same way they were allowed to judge Dart. And until that footage is released, the narrative won't slow down. Because when one player is criticized in the dark, people naturally assume there's more to hide than there actually is. And that assumption is what turned this from a draft discussion into a credibility debate. As the noise around the interview grew louder, a strange thing started happening. People stopped talking about what Shedeur Sanders did on the field and started obsessing over what they thought he was like in a room none of them had seen. And that's when the numbers quietly began exposing the disconnect. Because if you strip away the speculation and go back to production, the story shifts fast. Sanders wasn't just efficient, he was elite by measurable standards. Completion percentage matters in the NFL. It always has. And Sanders finishing near the top of his class wasn't accidental. That level of accuracy doesn't come from luck. It comes from timing, processing speed, and confidence in reads. Traits teams swear they value, yet somehow ignored when the narrative changed. Touchdowns told the same story. While other quarterbacks chased volume, Sanders consistently finished drives. Red zone execution, third down efficiency, situational awareness. These are the exact traits evaluators claim separate prospects, yet they were pushed aside in favor of vague concerns that couldn't be verified. That contradiction is why so many scouts pushed back quietly. Inside league circles, reports began surfacing that several teams still had Sanders graded higher than quarterbacks being discussed ahead of him publicly. Not by hype, by tape. The issue wasn't ability, it was comfort. Some teams weren't sure how to interpret a quarterback who didn't fit the traditional mold of humility through submission during interviews. Confidence has always been a double standard in the NFL. When it comes from certain players, it's leadership. When it comes from others, it's labeled as ego. Sanders never ducked responsibility. He never blamed teammates. He never shied away from pressure. But because he didn't shrink himself in interviews, that confidence became something to question rather than admire. Meanwhile, the numbers kept stacking in his favor. Efficiency under pressure, ball security in critical moments, command at the line of scrimmage. None of those disappeared just because someone didn't like how an interview felt. And that's when analysts began asking an uncomfortable question. Are we evaluating quarterbacks or personalities? Because once production stops mattering, the process breaks. This wasn't about denying that interviews matter. They do. But interviews are context, not conclusions. They're meant to support what the tape shows, not overwrite it completely. And in Sanders' case, the tape never stopped speaking. That's why the debate refused to die. Every time someone tried to dismiss him, the numbers pulled him back into the conversation. Every time perception took over, performance forced its way back in. And that tension between what people felt and what the data showed is what turned this from draft chatter into a full-blown controversy. Because when facts and narratives don't align, eventually one of them cracks. At some point, the conversation stopped being about evaluation and turned into reputation control. And that pivot happened the moment the Giants chose silence. When footage from Jackson Dart's interview surfaced, the reaction was immediate. Awkward pauses, forced answers, a visible disconnect. It wasn't flattering, and yet it was released anyway. That single decision poured gasoline on an already smoldering situation. Because if Dart's interview could be shown publicly, why was Shedeur Sanders still locked away? That question changed everything. Instead of clarity, the silence created suspicion. Instead of closure, it invited speculation. Fans weren't asking for spin anymore. They wanted context. They wanted to see the same standard applied across the board. And the longer the footage stayed hidden, the louder the theories became. Reports began circulating that Sanders didn't handle pressure well in the room. Others claimed he pushed back on questions. But none of those descriptions came with proof, just second-hand interpretations. And once those interpretations hit social media, they hardened into labels. That's when the interview became a red flag, not because of what was shown, but because of what wasn't. Behind the scenes, it's been said the Giants used a common evaluation tactic, inserting intentional mistakes into install material to test recall and attention to detail. According to sources, Sanders didn't catch every planted error and grew visibly frustrated when challenged on it. That frustration, some evaluators argue, was misread as attitude rather than engagement. And that distinction matters. Quarterbacks are wired to compete. They're trained to correct, challenge, and assert control of information. Frustration in that context doesn't always signal entitlement. Sometimes it signals intensity. But once a perception is formed in a draft room, it's hard to undo. What made this moment explosive wasn't the mistake itself. It was the imbalance. One quarterback's flaws were broadcast. Another's were summarized selectively through whispers. And in a league obsessed with optics, that imbalance became the story. Media voices jumped in fast. Some framed Sanders' response as a lack of self-awareness. Others questioned his fit culturally. The football conversation took a back seat. Suddenly, leadership was being debated without footage. Confidence was being judged without context. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If Sanders had nailed that interview perfectly, the tape would have been released already. Silence doesn't calm narratives, it feeds them. And in this case, it turned one interview into a defining moment, not because of what the public saw, but because of what they weren't allowed to see. And that's when the controversy stopped being about performance. It became about control. Once the interview narrative took hold, the shift was immediate. Football tape stopped leading the conversation, and media interpretation took the wheel. What followed wasn't analysis, it was amplification. One of the loudest voices to enter the discussion framed the situation in extreme terms, calling Sanders' interview presence a deal-breaker. The claim spread fast, headlines followed, clips were looped, and suddenly, one reported moment outweighed multiple seasons of production. That's how quickly perception can replace evidence during draft season. The criticism centered on a single idea, confidence being misread as resistance. Sanders was reportedly asked to walk through broken plays and identify errors that weren't always obvious. When he pushed back or expressed frustration, it was framed not as competitiveness, but as defiance. That framing stuck, not because it was proven, but because it was repeated. And repetition creates truth in media cycles. What made this even stranger was the contradiction hiding in plain sight. Teams say they want quarterbacks who command the room, who aren't passive, who take ownership of the offense. But when Sanders showed assertiveness, it was treated as a flaw instead of a feature. Confidence became ego. Intensity became attitude. And leadership was suddenly up for debate. Meanwhile, the actual on-field resume barely moved the needle in these discussions. Completion percentage, elite, decision-making under pressure, consistently strong, production in high-visibility games, proven. Yet none of that slowed the momentum of the narrative. Because once a story fits a familiar media mold, it becomes easier to sell than nuance. Former players weighed in. Some suggested Sanders did embrace the grind. Others hinted he might be selective about situations. But again, these were interpretations, not confirmations. No footage, no direct quotes, just opinions stacked on top of each other until they felt definitive. Here's the key problem with that approach. Draft evaluations are supposed to reduce risk, not manufacture it. When media voices start treating speculation as substance, teams feel pressure to justify decisions that may not fully align with the tape. And that's when football logic starts bending. Sanders didn't suddenly forget how to read defenses. He didn't lose accuracy overnight. What changed was the conversation around him. And once that conversation shifted, it became easier to question everything else. But narratives don't survive contact with reality for long. Because while the debate was raging on television and social media, something else was happening quietly, on practice fields, in meeting rooms, and during live reps where opinions don't matter. And that's where the story takes another turn. Once the pads came on, and the cameras pulled back from debate shows, the noise didn't disappear, but it lost its power. Because football has a way of cutting through narratives fast. And this is where the conversation around Shedeur Sanders started to change in a way no interview clip ever could. Organized team activities didn't come with headlines or hot takes. They came with reps, reads, timing, command. And from the first few sessions, reports quietly began to surface that didn't match the storyline fans had been fed for months. Sanders wasn't tentative. He wasn't overwhelmed. He wasn't shrinking under the moment. He looked comfortable running an NFL offense. That detail mattered. Quarterbacks who struggle mentally don't hide it in practice. Confusion shows up immediately in footwork, in hesitation, in late throws. None of that was showing. Sanders was decisive. He was accurate. And most importantly, he was in control. Teammates responded to him naturally, not because of reputation, but because the ball came out on time and drives moved. That's when the first cracks appeared in the media narrative. Even some of the loudest critics began hedging. Phrases shifted. Certainty softened. What was once framed as a character flaw started being reframed as competitiveness. Confidence became presence. The same traits that were questioned during interviews suddenly looked valuable when applied between the lines. And then came the moment that made the entire debate impossible to ignore. One prominent voice who had previously labeled Sanders a risk did a complete reversal after watching live reps. No qualifiers, no half measures. The assessment flipped from skepticism to endorsement. Sanders wasn't just holding his own. He was outperforming expectations. That kind of shift doesn't happen lightly. Veteran quarterbacks don't lose ground to rookies by accident. If a young quarterback starts pushing the tempo, commanding the huddle, and stacking clean practices, coaches notice. And when coaches notice, depth charts start to change quietly, long before fans hear a word. This is where perception collided with performance. The interview controversy hadn't disappeared, but it suddenly felt smaller, less important, because football doesn't reward narratives, it rewards execution, and Sanders was executing at a level that forced reevaluation. Which leads to the uncomfortable question no one wanted to ask out loud. If the film and the practice reps were always this solid, why did the conversation drift so far away from them in the first place? And that question brings us to the heart of the issue. How quickly draft evaluations can be shaped by storylines instead of substance, and how rare it is for a player to flip that script once it's written. But that wasn't the end of it. Because the deeper analysts went, the harder it became to justify why Sanders was ever placed behind certain names to begin with. Once the emotional takes cooled off and the practice buzz settled, the conversation inevitably circled back to something far less subjective: the numbers. And this is where the debate around Shedeur Sanders became even harder to dismiss. Because when you strip away interviews, body language speculation, and anonymous quotes, production doesn't lie. Sanders wasn't just efficient in college, he was elite. A completion percentage hovering in the mid-70s isn't a small edge, it's separation. That level of accuracy reflects timing, anticipation, and decision-making, not just arm talent. Meanwhile, the quarterbacks consistently ranked ahead of him entered the league with noticeably lower efficiency, despite operating in systems with less weekly scrutiny and fewer spotlight moments. Touchdowns told a similar story. Sanders consistently turned drives into points without padding stats or chasing volume. Red zone execution, third down efficiency, and situational calm were all present. These are the exact traits teams claim matter most when evaluating quarterbacks for Sundays, not Saturdays. And yet those traits somehow became background noise. Instead, the narrative locked onto intangibles that couldn't be measured, debated endlessly, and never fully proven. Leadership was questioned despite teammates rallying around him. Poise was doubted despite years of pressure-filled performances. Confidence was reframed as arrogance, even though that same confidence is celebrated when it comes from quarterbacks who fit a more familiar mold. That contradiction is impossible to ignore. Because if Sanders' resume belonged to a different name, the conversation likely looks very different. His efficiency would be praised. His calm would be labeled maturity. His confidence would be framed as readiness. But once a storyline takes hold, facts are often forced to fight uphill. What made this moment especially revealing was how quickly opinions shifted once evaluation returned to football environments. Coaches didn't debate tone or posture. They evaluated throws, reads, command, and Sanders checked those boxes repeatedly. That doesn't mean the interview controversy didn't happen. It means its weight may have been inflated far beyond its relevance. Quarterbacks aren't built in whiteboard rooms. They're built in collapsing pockets, tight windows, and late-game pressure. Sanders had already proven he could operate there. The numbers backed it up. The tape backed it up. And now, the early NFL reps were doing the same. Which leaves one unavoidable realization. If the evaluation process had started and ended with football, this wouldn't have been a controversy at all. It would have been a discussion about upside, readiness, and fit, not character, tone, or perception. And that realization sets the stage for the final question, one that reaches beyond Shedeur Sanders and into how the league evaluates quarterbacks in the first place. And this is where the entire Shedeur Sanders debate reaches its breaking point. Because once football took over, the noise didn't just quiet down, it started to contradict itself. The same voices that questioned his readiness before the draft began changing their tone once practices, OTAs, and real reps entered the picture. Not hypotheticals, not interviews, actual football. And suddenly, Sanders didn't look overwhelmed. He didn't look lost. He didn't look like someone who wasn't the guy. He looked comfortable. That's the part no narrative survives. When a quarterback steps into a professional environment and immediately shows command, accuracy, and confidence, it forces a recalibration. Reads happen faster. Throws come out cleaner. Teammates respond differently. And that response matters more than any pre-draft storyline ever could. This doesn't mean the interview process is irrelevant. Teams should evaluate personality, communication, and recall. But when those moments begin to outweigh years of tape, production, and leadership, the process itself deserves scrutiny. Because history is full of quarterbacks who aced interviews and failed on Sundays. And it's also full of quarterbacks who were doubted, labeled difficult, or misunderstood until the ball was snapped. What makes Sanders' case so polarizing isn't just what happened. It's how quickly opinions hardened without evidence, and how slowly they softened once evidence appeared. That's not evaluation, that's inertia. And once a narrative forms, it takes extraordinary performance to reverse it. Sanders didn't argue. He didn't campaign. He didn't leak stories. He let reps speak. He let throws speak. He let teammates speak. And slowly, reality started pushing back. The uncomfortable truth for critics is this. If Sanders had truly failed the way some suggested, the story would have ended quietly. Instead, it keeps resurfacing. Because every new football moment complicates the old assumptions. which leads to the real issue this saga exposes. Not whether Shedeur Sanders belongs in the NFL, but whether the league and the media ecosystem around it sometimes confuses confidence with defiance, composure with arrogance, and difference with danger. And when that happens, the evaluation isn't just flawed, it's incomplete. That's why this conversation won't end with one interview, one take, or one practice. Because as long as Sanders continues to perform when the lights are on, the narrative will be forced to evolve or collapse. And that brings us to the only question that actually matters moving forward. Not what was said behind closed doors, but what happens when the results keep speaking louder than the doubts. And that's where this entire saga ultimately lands. Because no matter how loud the opinions get, no matter how many narratives are built behind closed doors, football has a way of stripping everything down to one unavoidable truth. You either deliver when the reps are real, or you don't. And Shedeur Sanders has done nothing but answer the bell when the game environment replaces the interview room. What makes this situation so revealing isn't just how Sanders was evaluated. It's how quickly perception hardened before the evidence was complete. One uncomfortable interview, filtered through second-hand accounts, somehow carried more weight than years of high-level production, leadership under pressure, and on-field command. That imbalance is what continues to bother people, and rightly so. Because if the evaluation process is truly about projecting success on Sundays, then Sundays have to matter more than sound bites. Sanders didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't demand validation. He didn't run from the criticism. He simply kept playing. And every rep since has chipped away at the assumptions that once followed him. Teammates respond to him. Coaches trust him. Analysts who once doubted him are quietly revising their stance. Not because of hype, but because reality keeps interfering with the narrative. That's the part that makes this story uncomfortable for some. It forces a reflection on how often confidence is penalized when it doesn't fit a familiar mold. How often leadership is questioned when it comes wrapped in individuality. And how quickly a quarterback can be boxed in by perception before the league ever gives him a fair runway. This doesn't mean Shedeur Sanders is guaranteed anything. The NFL is ruthless. Talent has to be sustained. Growth has to continue. Nothing is handed out. But what has already been proven is that he belongs in the conversation and that his ability was never the weak point. So the real takeaway isn't about the Giants, or one interview, or one talking head's opinion. It's about whether the league is willing to let performance correct the record instead of defending the story it already told. Because in the end, narratives fade, film doesn't. And if Shedeur Sanders keeps letting his play do the talking, this entire controversy won't be remembered as a warning sign about him. It'll be remembered as a lesson about how easy it is to misjudge someone before the game has its say. The only question left is how long it takes everyone else to catch up.